How large is Auschwitz? It's a question which is hard to be answered for the last close to 80 years. Is it a term itself which accommodates a phenomena of Auschwitz itself? Is it a term which addresses only to the physicality of what was Auschwitz? Whether it addresses only to the physicality of Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, or maybe the entire larger complex of Auschwitz, which means close to 48 subcamps, at its peak accommodating close to 130,000 of slave labor force. We are somewhere at the outskirts of the city of Oświęcim, which in between 1939 and 1945 was named by the German Nazis Auschwitz after being incorporated into the Third Reich. We are somewhere on the eastern edges of the city. We are close to the village which is called Monowitz, named under the German Nazis as Monowitz. And somewhere behind me is an enormous factory which was built as an investment correlated with the early years or early months of functioning of Auschwitz as we know it. Yes, Auschwitz, even physically, is a much larger term than the museum today. Auschwitz physicality encompasses the territory of 48 subcamps that Auschwitz was made out of. One of the largest of these subcamps is Auschwitz II-Birkenau. So the enlargement of Auschwitz I, built 3 kilometers from Auschwitz I in order to accommodate the additional slave labor force from 1941-42 and to be used as a mass extermination camp per se from 1942. But then the system was being developed into even larger. The more in time, the more in losing the war, the more additional investments were coming to the vicinity of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was becoming gradually a kind of a very desired zone of interest, of industrial investments, lower taxation, and of course slave labor force available. So behind me is the territory that we'll be entering, is the territory of the third largest subcamp of Auschwitz, the so-called Auschwitz III Monowitz, or Buna. Already a couple of months after the camp was started, and the camp technically starts in June of 1940, already in autumn of 1940, there are engineers connected to the IG Farben complex, industrial complex, or actually engineers connected to BASF company as we know it today, because they were coming here as BASF engineers. One of those men was called Otto Ambros. They are coming here as early as autumn 1940 in order to negotiate a contract for a location and investment of a huge factory complex to produce synthetic rubber and fuel, and at the same time use and abuse the slave labor force of Auschwitz inmates. The initial contract was talking about a couple of thousands of Polish political prisoners to be made available at the factory construction site. Factory construction site meant a territory 12 kilometers from Auschwitz I proper, which in the first year meant that those exploited inmates had to be marched 12 kilometers in the morning, 8 to 12 hours of daily work shift, and then 12 kilometers back to Auschwitz I. Ultimately, as the system develops, grows into experience, and bases itself on the best possible practice, but also the best possible practice of economic exploitation, Auschwitz goes into construction of subcamps, which means a part of exploitation of people in the factories, they are deciding to station those people at the factory's premises by construction of subcamps. We are standing here somewhere on the edge of what used to be Auschwitz III Monowitz. Very soon we are going to see the factory a little bit bigger. We are standing right now next to a concrete pillbox that were built in hundreds surrounding the Auschwitz complex in 1944, when the German Nazis are expecting the Soviet front line to arrive here, and in hectic preparation they are building defense lines in order to hold to their positions while the Soviets will be attacking. Of course, in most cases such pillboxes or bunkers were of no usage. Also, they were taking the role of individual hideout for the soldiers, SS soldiers that were working on the so-called larger guarding chain, the große Postenkette, in case of a bombardment. And those bombardments were becoming more and more frequent, especially from summer 44. We need to remember that roughly from April of 1944, the Allied planes are taking off in Brindisi and Poltava are starting to have an aerial reach here, and they are taking pictures, reconnaissance pictures of Auschwitz. We have such pictures particularly from May of 1944. At the same time period, a month later, in June 44, the regular bombardment of the engineering and technological installations around Auschwitz are started. So the construction site of an almost accomplished chemical plant of Auschwitz III Monowitz is being pretty heavily bombarded in summer 1944. Thus, those pillboxes for protection of the camp staff. If you look at the aerial pictures taken by the Allies in spring of 1944, you can very clearly see and map the location of Auschwitz III Monowitz in the vicinity of construction site. And you can very easily see and map the bunker next to which we are right now standing. This bunker was one of the perimeter bunkers a little bit outside the fences of the camp itself. The territory of the camp itself is right now covered by the structures of the village.
The German industry, which was already massively involved in supporting the German Nazis financially before the war, would never skip an opportunity not to invest in the vicinity of camps and get access to slave labor force. One of the largest players like this was the IG Farben corporation, created out of a merge of 6 major pharmaceutical and chemical factories in Germany in 1925, among them BASF and Bayer. Their subsidiary was Degesch, the company which specialized in production of Cyclone B, used later for the mass extermination in Auschwitz itself. You can up until now see the canisters with Cyclone B with the trademark of Degesch, the same trademark which the company uses up until now.
So the history of Auschwitz is also a history of economic exploitation. Auschwitz, in all of the stages of being created, has also this enormous dimension of being created as a place of exploitation of slave labor force. Yes, it realizes the ideological aims of the Third Reich, but why not at the same time period use those masses of people who are sentenced to Auschwitz, or sometimes just selected to Auschwitz? Why not to use them economically? Why not to use them for the benefit of the Third Reich? Or why not to use it for the benefit of the wartime capitalism? Auschwitz and the so-called Interessengebiet, which means a zone of over 40 square kilometers surrounding the very proximity of Auschwitz, was changed over time of 1940-41 into a zone of economic incentives for investment. Yes, German, Austrian, or even global factories are trying to invest, they're even competing against each other to invest in the vicinity of Auschwitz, because the German Nazis are keeping it very promising. They are promising the eternal Third Reich, so they are promising from the perspective of 1940 or 41 that this war will be won, and then their system will be dominant in this part of Europe. They are promising large governmental contracts for the war production and the war supply, and they are promising a lot of benefits in the very vicinity of Auschwitz. The first benefit worth mentioning is very cheap because slave workforce. Very few of those industrialists, if any, are showing any traces of moral questioning or ethical questioning of this whole situation. No, they are just coming and investing their money, just like capitalists investing the money nowadays in different parts of the world which are either conflict-torn or economically disadvantaged, just for one purpose, for the purpose of multiplication of capital itself, without asking too many moral questions about the conditions in which this capital is multiplied. Such is the history of Auschwitz industrialization. We are talking of over 40 companies investing in this Interessengebiet, in the zone of interest. Of course, we are right now at the territory of IG Farben or BASF, which was the largest. But there were multiple other factories that on a daily basis were using hundreds of thousands, in case of Auschwitz III Monowitz, up to 10 to 12,000 of inmates at a time, stationed either at the factory territory or in the nearby Auschwitz III Monowitz, just for the sake of providing slave labor for the brilliant economic future of the Third Reich and German secession. Such is the reality of war then, and such is the reality of war now. The question is how often we are closing our eyes in realizing the parallels, in seeing the similarities. How often are we finding the courage in flipping over the labels in the clothing we are using and asking the question where Bangladesh is and who is working there and in what conditions? How often do we question ourselves about a new pair of sneakers that we just bought at a great occasion? How often are we asking ourselves in what kind of conditions and at what kind of cost it must have been produced? The cost is not us, and we are not asking those questions. Just like we were not asking them then, we are unfortunately very rarely asking them now. So one of the lessons of Auschwitz and the Holocaust shall definitely be trying to realize and take responsibility for the larger picture of economy of conflict. Because somewhere in this larger picture of economy of conflict, somewhere behind the headlines talking about tens of thousands of people expelled as refugees, or thousands of Uyghurs being right now worked in the Chinese labor camps, somewhere behind those big numbers, there are individual human beings, there are individual family units, and there is a human misery which is employed in slave labor exploitation for the sake of our comfort of using a good for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or sometimes even short. What is left of Monowitz today are monuments. So a part of the artifacts of the factory itself and the buildings which are used for industrial production today. There are monuments built on the outskirts and fortifications and pillboxes and different bunkers in the vicinity of the place. The site of former factory started to be used as an industrial complex from the 50s. There was almost no memory of this site up until the 60s. In the 60s, the first monuments were erected at the former sub-camps of Auschwitz. But the 60s is generally an important time for memory construction because it was in the 60s when the first monuments are erected at the former camps themselves. The monument we know from Birkenau, the monument that was established in Treblinka, Sobibor, Belgrade, but also the first conceptual thinking about converting the historical sites in Germany, sites like Dachau, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Oranienburg, into Gedenkstätte, into memorials, was actually initiated in the 60s. So in the 60s, a certain silence, which is always stiffening dialogue and memory transfer right after the liberation and right after the genocide, it was only in the 60s when it was challenged with narrative, and this narrative at first was meeting the first needed standards of humanity, the first needed standards of humanity commemorating, which means a monument, something of stone, something physical, something visible, something which will have a plaque attached into it.